I did.
Anyhow, over to you.
Thank you, Douglas. Have a seat. I want to invite to join us up here Dr. Dina Lisnyansky and Dr. Dan Scheuftan. Dina is from the Department of, it said, History of the Middle East, and in Tel Aviv University and Ariel. She was a fellow at Oxford University, and her upcoming book is called Crescents and Croissants, Preaching Islam in Europe. Dan Scheuftan is considered the rudest person in Israel. It's a very difficult thing to achieve, and we've brought him here to balance Douglas's politeness. And he is the head of the International Graduate Program in National Security Studies at Haifa University. And we have about an hour, and so the way we would like to conduct this is I would like the two panelists to respond in whatever ways their thoughts to Douglas's talk or book or argument, and then Douglas would respond to them, each 10 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion for questions from me and from you. So, Dan, why don't you go first?
First, one short comment to Douglas. I think it can help your book, and I was surprised not to find it there, that Sisi said a short time ago, why are we surprised that the Europeans don't like Arab immigration? After all, we destroyed our countries, and now we're coming to Europe with the same culture to destroy theirs. And if you want the full text of it, it's fascinating. When I saw it reported in Egypt, I didn't believe that it was true until I saw a video of Sisi saying it. I thought it's fake news. I think it can be an interesting contribution, particularly to make some people unhappy, which is what I get up in the morning for. Concerning my contribution here to the discussion, I'd like to speak a little bit about the hostility to Israel exactly by the same people who want to commit suicide in Europe. And I think it is interesting because I think Israel is threatening the identity of these elites in Europe and threatening Europe in what Europe wants to think about itself. And therefore, I think it is interesting to juxtapose the European ethos with the Israeli ethos, and I think they're more or less on two ends of the same continuum. The Israeli ethos being a bit similar to the American ethos, and the European ethos being very, very different, and particularly the specific part of the ethos that you're discussing in your book in such an interesting way. I think the best way to characterize what I've learned from your book is that the Europeans have lost what Schopenhauer calls das Wille zum Leben, the desire to live, okay? Because everything about Europe is about having lost this element. First of all, look at the number of children in Europe. In Germany, for instance, they have half the number of children than you have in Israel. And throughout Europe, this is one of the major problems. And people who have no children, I think, have lost optimism in a very, very fundamental way, because what do you get up in the morning for if you're not interested in the future, and if you don't want to have children, and if you don't enjoy your children? I was speaking at a very prestigious institution in Germany, and just to provoke the people, I said, "Oh, you don't like your children?" And I thought they would say, and I said, "Well, I understand why. When they grow up, they'll be German, so I understand why." So, to my surprise, one of them said, "Yes, that's right." And I asked, how many of you here consider your children to be a nuisance? And again, to my surprise, a third raised their hand, namely 2/3 really feel like that. The other thing is the loss of pride in their own culture, and you discuss it in your book. very specifically, so I don't have to go into it. And the inability to say that European culture is superior and the culture of people who come in, part of these people, is inferior because they're not different. If you treat your women like cattle, you're not different, you're inferior. And if you don't say it, you've lost something very important in terms of pride in your own culture. It also explains, this ethos also explains the totalitarianism of the political correctness. Again, something that you discussed here this evening. It explains, as you've shown, the opening of the gates in an unrestricted manner to people who don't want to integrate in Europe, and is openly saying that it wants to threaten the culture in Europe. It explains the guilt, not only of colonialism, but the guilt of being proud of your own achievements. This is also something you should feel guilty about. It explains the fatigue, the Müdigkeit von Geschichte that you bring there. I think you probably all know the serenity prayer. God, give me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can and must change, and the wisdom to tell the two apart. I think everything in Europe falls in the first category, namely, give me the serenity to accept that I can change nothing, that I want to change in the direction that I want to change it. And the loss of legitimacy to protect by force your culture, if necessary by force, because the culture is something that you should protect. Because let's face it, all the values that we are all proud of came from Europe. So in terms of producing the values, you can trust Europe, but in terms of defending them, you can't trust them. You need to go to the Americans or to somebody else who didn't lose their Wille zum Leben. Now, look at the Israeli ethos. It's exactly the opposite if you exclude the European in the bad sense of the term. You can. I learned this from Moshe Dayan. He used to have a term saying about a certain person, this is a good guy in the bad sense of the term. So, בחור טוב במובן הרע של המילה. When I spoke to the entourage of President Obama, this is how I characterized him. He's exactly a good guy in the bad sense of the term. He could be a poet, but why did he insist being the President of the United States? I'm not sure. So in Israel, we also have these Europeans in the best sense of the term. There are good senses of the term, but this is the bad sense of the term, the chattering classes in Israel. So there are exceptions. I'm not sure if Haaretz is represented here in this audience, but I think they should know. And by the way, when I'm speaking about this Israeli ethos, I mean all Israeli governments. Because even if you have opposition who would focus criticizing the governments on something, when it comes to treating Europe and considering Europe, let me give you only one example. Shlomo Ben Ami, certainly a person very committed to peace, who negotiated with the Palestinians the partitioning of Jerusalem and so on, characterizes in his book the Europeans, and he uses the terms betrayal, identity crisis, collective therapy. In other words, he says when the Europeans speak, they're just trying to it's a therapeutical process of trying to deal with their own problems rather than dealing with the issues at hand. And when you look at the Israeli ethos, it's exactly the opposite of what I mentioned before concerning the European ethos. Hope, optimism, pride of Israeli achievements, contempt to people who are criticizing Israel in the way that European elites are very often criticizing Israel. And I think the most important achievement of Israel, and this is exactly what the Europeans cannot do, is to combine being Sparta on the outside and Athens on the inside. Namely, tough as nails, meaner than a junkyard dog vis-a-vis your enemies, and at the same time very soft inside. And if you look at the failure of the Arabs, it is because they are Sparta on the outside and on the inside, and the failure of Europe is being Athens on the outside and on the inside. And Israel is trying, I think with some success, to combine the two. And of course, children. I mean, we don't live in a democracy here. We live in a pedocracy, namely the children are in power. And this is how I think Israelis like it, and certainly I do. The only people I'm willing really to listen to are my children, because they know me and they don't take me too seriously. And you have enough self-confidence to protect what you have and to be willing to use force if there is no other way, and to give legitimacy to it. And when you look at the war that is waged against Israel, not only the physical war, but also the psychological and political war, the Israelis consider with, I think, justified contempt both what international organizations are saying about Israel. I mean, the United Nations, where the Saudis accuse Israel of not treating women well enough, and the Europeans that abstain from these votes in the United Nations, and so-called human rights organizations that only know the human rights of terrorists, not of their victims. Only terrorists have human rights, others don't. And now I come to the conclusion, because Gadi is already threatening me and saying that the Europeans have all these excuses of what they cannot do in order to justify the fact that they want to capitulate. Because you get up in the morning in Europe, you look out the window, you say, what a beautiful day, who can I capitulate to today? And in order to justify it, you have to say that force doesn't work. And Israel demonstrates that if you have to use force, and you use force, it works, so you don't have to capitulate. Take the Second Intifada. I don't think any civilized society has ever been under a terrorist attack like Israel in the Second Intifada. So we went out and broke their faces and brought down terrorism 98%. And it worked. And this is an insult to Europe, because they say you can't deal with it with force. Now, I'm not speaking about solution. The only thing that has a solution is a crossword puzzle. I'm saying about bringing terrorism down from an unacceptable level to an acceptable level. And we've done it by force, and you are not ashamed of it, and you don't feel guilty about it. And this is a threat to European identity, because it says a civilized person doesn't have to capitulate. He has an option to stand for something. And therefore, I understand why they don't like us. And I'm very proud that they don't like us. And one last comment here. Vis-a-vis Europe, Israel has a problem, but no dilemma. The problem is that the European can hurt us, and to some extent they do hurt us, much less than they can, but they do. But we have no dilemma, because whatever they can do to us is not as bad as listening to them. If God forbid we would have listened to the Europeans, Saddam Hussein would have had nuclear weapons, because it's against Article 27, Section A of some document that I won't even bother to read. And Assad would have had nuclear weapons, and suicide terrorists would be roaming the streets of Tel Aviv. So listening to the Europeans is not an option. And this insults them, and it should. And I'm delighted.
Well, as Dan's daughter is fond of saying, Dad, you're not an example of anything. And so also not of the Israeli elites. I think, Dan, there is a European-like tendency among our elites that is increasingly felt, and perhaps has been stemmed by these last elections, but we don't know. So I'll pass the microphone to Dina. You have one. please.
So yes, hello. First of all, thank you for coming here. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I really like your book. I brought it back from London, and since then I've been recommending it to all my students. And it would be really hard to speak after these two because they are really genuinely funny, and also I'm not used to this kind of, let's say, sincere talk, because usually I attend academic conferences where we're not supposed to say anything but nothing. So I'm going to try to speak about two words maybe. Okay, so I will use two words that you've been using before and also in your book. I think the most interesting part that I found in your book was the fact that you were talking about the beginning of the whole phenomenon of people coming to Europe and the fact that they might have been they might have been supposed to return back to their homelands. This is something. This is a fact that we've never been, not just taught. We never thought about it as researchers of Islam in Europe, for instance. So for every sort of researcher of Islam in Europe, I think that would be sort of a revelation, let's say. But if I'm not going to talk about this kind of revelation, but about the discourse that exists regarding Islam in Europe, I would say that two words are being used, or abused rather, mostly. The first would be integration, and the second would be multiculturalism. And then I would say that both of these words are in fact dead at some point, at least, as far as I see it, because multiculturalism is a word that has been used so many times during the 90s and the early 2000s that it has no more meaning at all. And integration, let's talk about integration. Well, the way Europeans see integration really is very different from the way Muslims see integration. And today I think I will speak about the Muslim side, because you've been talking more about Europe and Israel, and I want to talk about Islam here. I want to talk about Muslims and the fact that a lot of Muslims in Europe, they understand integration not just differently, but they think that it is something that would kill their own culture, first of all. So when we speak about integration, Europeans hear it as a positive sentiment, whilst Muslims mostly would hear it as something very negative to their own cultures. And when I use the word culture, it's just a way to say religion. Because when we talk about Europe, we don't speak about religion at all, almost never. But when we speak about Islam, we keep forgetting that Islam is not just a culture, it's a religion. And that a lot of Europeans, in fact, when they talk about religion in general, they don't use the word Christianity anymore. They just use the word religion, because Islam is right now in its dawah state. Okay, dawah would be propagating Islam. It's a mission, and in a way of a missionary state, we would say that Islam is now the most developed and the most prominently developing religion in Europe as well. And we see it as a fact because a lot of people are being drawn to Islam because they are in fact looking for a solution to a kind of a non-spiritual state that they're feeling. And whenever they are looking for a more spiritual life, we can see as researchers that they turn more to Islam than to Christianity. There are a lot of reasons to that, but I would like to get back to integration and to attend to the vast number of well, you know what? I will talk about the fact that you were talking about a whole new identity that is supposed to, well, to be transformed within Europe in order to accommodate all the other cultures and identities. So we're not there yet, right? We're not there yet. We're like a couple of steps before that. But what we have now is, in fact, a kind of a hybrid identity to a lot of people. So these hybrid identities is something that I'd like to talk about for a bit. Most Muslims in Europe, they have more than just one identity. By the way, hybrid identity is not a double identity. It's just an identity that includes more than 2 or 3 components. For instance, being a Muslim, an Iraqi, an Arab, okay, in Britain means that you have a hybrid identity, okay? So most of the Muslims in Europe, have hybrid identities, which means that they can choose in different times of their lives the certain identity that they want to emphasize more at that certain point. And this is one of the reasons why people are searching themselves within the realm of Islamic organizations sometimes. This is one of the reasons why people are joining terrorist organizations sometimes. And this is one of the main reasons why so many people from Europe, and not just Europe, but from the West, joined ISIS and went to fight with the jihadis in Syria and Iraq. So when we speak about those hybrid identities, we should know that we're referring to also this domain as well. And now I would like to talk about the fact that you've mentioned 2015 and the 2 million people, which ended up to be less, about 1.8 million people who came as immigrants into Europe. So in Europe, in 2015, in the European Union, there were more than 26 million Muslims already. So why would these 2 millions be something of interference? Why would it keep people, feeling that it's such a horribly huge number? Why would people fear of that number so much? We're talking about 2 millions in a continent that has more than 26 millions of Muslims already. So why now? And the answer was, in fact, it was all connected to these hybrid identities that I was speaking about. Because when second and third generation of Muslim immigrants, I mean children and grandchildren of the people who came to Europe as almost secular Muslims, by the way, while they were looking for a better life for themselves and for their children later on, their children and grandchildren were already more religious than the parents were, because they were in search of their own identities. And at this point, when 2 million people, almost 2 million people, came from the Middle East inside of Europe, the main fear of the authorities, at least, and of parts of media maybe, the main fear was that they would ignite that connection that many of the second and third generation Muslims would have with the more radical Islamic ideologies that exist already. That they would search for their own connections to the big Islamic ummah, as they call it, Islamic nation. So these couple of points, I think that they're mentioned briefly in your book. And this is something that needs a further discussion, I think, and it would have to be elaborated some more. And just a couple of more words, I would like to tell you, I've been during the Bataclan terror attacks in Paris. In fact, I was just nearby in another theater, and I remember that 24 hours of silence. It was felt really, harshly inside of Paris. People were not going out on the streets on the next day. People were waiting patiently to see what is going to happen. And the atmosphere was warlike atmosphere. The main thing that we, as people from Israel who were there, just by chance, the main thing that we were fearing most then was not the terrorist attacks. It was the reaction that they would bring. And I think that the main problem that Europe is facing now is that we don't really know the reaction that would bring this whole radicalization stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Before I pass the microphone to Douglas again, I just want to throw in an American perspective, since this happens to be my profession, and ask maybe the idea of multiculturalism is one more misadoption of an American concept. Because in America, multiculturalism is a bluff. It is a sociological bluff and an ideological bluff. First of all, it's a sociological bluff because it assumes uniformity. It assumes that culture is only your kind of food and my kind of music. and that basically we all have the same culture and we all believe in diversity. So that in the level of values, we all share the same value, and culture is just the icing on the cake. And this is a typically American way to view things, because Americans are blind to their own national identity and their own nationalism. And secondly, it's an ideological bluff, because it seems to assume that multiculturalism is an extension of the value of equality. Once we only treated people equally, now we will treat their values with equal respect, therefore deepening our respect of them. And this is, of course, a lie, because if, as Dan mentions, you treat with equal respect people who value their own women like cattle, then you're not advancing equality. Equality of values is not an extension of equality between people. So, so perhaps Europe has taken American lies too seriously.
That's a very good point indeed. Thank you, all three of you, for that. Let me just respond in a few minutes, if I may. Firstly, this difference between the Israeli and the European ethos, which you identified, Dan. I mean, it's clearly there. It's been described in the past. I think Bob Kagan described it as the people living in history and people who think they're living after history. Obviously, modern Europe is the clearest example of a people who think they're living after history, that is, after historical events have all finished. And Israel is so clearly, to all of us who come here and know it, is clearly still living in history. And that means that you know that things can still happen, you still have things to fight for, things necessary to kill for and even to die for. And that's what we were used to. We erroneously think that we've gone past. But this idea that several people mentioned of the difficulty, you mentioned superior and inferior culture. This is absolutely at the core of the point, isn't it? A few years ago, well, 15 years ago now, more, Martin Amis, a British novelist, was at an event in London and asked his audience, a sort of right-on audience, a sort of art gallery audience. You wouldn't necessarily say it's your typical audience, but still, a sort of cultural elite audience. And Amis asked his audience, raise your hand if you feel morally superior to the Taliban. Nobody would raise their hand. Nobody would raise their hand, because to raise their hand,
Europeans will
to be morally inferior.
to raise, because to raise your hands and to say that there are some people and some cultures that are superior and some are inferior is one of the things they don't think they can trust themselves with as a judgment. Which brings me on to the second one they can't trust themselves with. We now know from two people who were near her at the time that when Angela Merkel made the decision on the last day of August 2015, one of the things absolutely at the heart of the decision-making was this single observation. The migrants were coming to the German border. She said, we cannot have photographs of German border guards pointing guns at migrants. We cannot have those photos going around the world. And that was one of the absolutely core reasons that she said that we should not any longer sustain normal border policy. Let me give you another example of that. One of the leaders of the Alternative for Deutschland party, AfD, in Germany, was asked a couple of years ago in an interview. They're only a 5-year-old political party. They're obviously now the formal party of opposition in the Bundestag, but they're sort of, some of them are political novices, not all, but one of them was asked in an interview a couple of years ago, if people are coming to the border, and do you think that, it was a hypothetical question that all experienced politicians know not to go down that route. But she was asked, and then finally the last bit was, and if they are going to point their gun at them, do you think there is any point at which they should shoot people who are illegally coming across the border? And this relatively then novice politician said yes. Every single newspaper headline in Europe, the next day's headline was, German far-right party leader says shoot migrants at border. but you see, it's not just that that's a sort of twist on a word or a slightly malicious representation of it. It's because of this central thing that modern Europeans think they cannot trust themselves with force. That's one of the absolutely central things. Maybe they cannot trust themselves with a gun. or trust their nation with guns, or trust their... They can't trust... I mean, let's give it another way. One of the leaders, because Germany obviously is on the absolute cusp of this, so let's go right to the heart of it. I was in Berlin again the other week, and I was doing a debate about nationalism, and I had to say to them, I was not as rude as you are, Dan, but I gave a more anglicised version of it, and I said to them, we're discussing nationalism, let's get to the core of it. It's not just that some people should have, that nationalism as a concept might have problems. It's that we don't think we Europeans can be trusted with nationalism, and specifically we don't think you Germans can be trusted with nationalism. Let's get the root of it. That's the thing. That's the thing that's the bit of the crime that we're still most going over. But the point is, again, is that one of the leaders of the AfD a little while ago described in a speech the Nazi era in Germany as, I think he said, it was like a speck of bird shit on the shoulder of the German nation. Now, what was he trying to do? He was trying, presumably, to find some plausible, reasonable attitude to German history that didn't involve saying to young Germans, you are the Holocaust and World War II and nothing else, and you have something in your DNA that means that every century you turn genocidal. And he was trying to say something about we should live. At the same time, it sounds like he's diminishing the 20th century by this specific thing. And then he talks about the wonders of German culture, and as a Jewish friend of mine in Paris said, I don't want to hear a German politician telling me about the wonders of German culture. I just don't want to hear it. Okay, so lots of people feel this. Lots of people know this. And it comes back to this thing, can we trust ourselves with the basic elements of war, of culture, peace, the whole lot? Let me just quickly get onto the integration and multiculturalism points. You're entirely right, and these are terms that are effectively now dead. The multiculturalism term I was never fond of because I always thought it was heard differently by different people. If you criticised multiculturalism, some people thought that you were criticising multiracialism. You were criticising the idea of anyone of a different skin colour being in your city or country. And formally, of course, as Prime Minister Sarkozy, David Cameron and others said in 2010-11 when this started to change around, formally multiculturalism meant whether or not you should, as a state, support people living different lifestyles within your country. But this is a massive mishearing. So that if anyone said, I don't like the multiculturalism thing, they could immediately, plausibly be branded an absolute racist. So nobody wanted to criticize the multicultural era. And many people's careers, certainly, and some people's lives were sacrificed on this altar. I mean, I think that you make a very important point on the integration point. Yes, that there is an American version of this that has been important. The hyphenated, the idea that we could get around it by a hyphenation, for instance. And we have this additional problem that, as you say accurately, that people from immigrant communities very often hear this in a different way themselves. So, for instance, I hear a lot from Muslim families. They don't want their daughters, in particular, of course, to be integrated, because they say, we see your daughters, and we don't like what your daughters do, and so we don't want it for ours. And again, as with all criticisms, there's a smidgen of something recognizable in it. And that makes it far harder to answer. But yes, this is why we're in this very strange dialogue at the moment with all, as it were, newcomer communities. Effectively, we're in a dialogue like this. We say, we would now, after decades of thinking differently, we would now like you to become like us. And this comes to my exclusion-inclusion point. What if the person says, thank you very much for your invitation, but no? And we say, oh, but we'd very much like you to. And they say, the answer's still no. They say, please. And the answer then is, what are you going to do about it? The answer to which is, oh, nothing. So this comes to the point, if there is no exclusionary part to your language, then effectively there's no inclusionary part either, because you're not really including them, because there's always this opt-out to get out of the whole thing. Let me just wrap up with a couple of other points. The first, on the issue of the appeal of religion. This is so crucial. You see it everywhere. And so many conversations I've had with converts in Europe come down to this. Some of you will know the remarkable novel published in 2015 by the French novelist Michael Houellebecq, Submission. And it's a very important novel for all sorts of reasons, and I've always said, writes at a pitch of relevance and significance that almost no other living novelist, I think, has attained. But there's an extraordinary bit in that book, which is the moment when the main character in this sort of Islamified France of the 2020s desperately tries to re-engage with the religion of his birth. And again, it's not as if we haven't got to the problem we currently find ourselves in for no reason. You know, we've had not, you know, people forget, of course, that before the wars of nation states, we had the wars of religion in Europe. So we are also very worried about what religion can do at its essence. The result of which is to throw the whole thing away, as we've done. But at this point in Submission, the character goes to the south of France, to the place where he hopes for the revelation from the Madonna, for the statue of Madonna that his great hero Huysman has had a revelation before, a century earlier. And he sits in front of the Madonna, and he so wants the moment to come, the moment of transcendence, the moment of faith, and it doesn't happen. And I've thought about this a lot. I've tried to urge people to think about this more themselves in Europe, but I have this halfway answer to it, which is to say, at the very least, engage yourselves in that. At least find yourselves before it and see what happens. At the very worst, you'll aim high and miss. But to decide that you don't need to aim for the transcendent at all is a monumental error, because, as you said as well, it means effectively if you have nothing to live for, you have nothing to die for. A final thought, what comes next? In the 2 years since this book came out in English, I've been traveling, as I say, around almost every country in Europe again, and I think about this a lot, and I'm trying to keep something of a tab on it. I speak to politicians everywhere I go, and, you know, it worries me because we've got terminology slippage in Europe on a massive scale. Almost everybody has been described as a fascist or far right or neo-Nazi or Nazi and so on, and I'm very, very worried about it, because there's almost nobody willing to carry out the fine-tuned surgery you need to carry out to work out who is who and what is what, so that within individual parties you can absolutely see this is a part of the party that's totally legitimate and would be the answer, and this is a part that will lead us to hell again. And my gosh, that's a fine judgment call, and it differs between individuals, it differs between countries, it differs between parties. And it fills me with horror that even now, at this stage, it's like this. And I say sometimes when I'm in Germany or France, you know, since my own country voted to leave the European Union, which I did as well, since my country voted to leave the European Union, there's been this sort of, oh, well, there's just these difficult Brits, you know, notoriously difficult people, which we are, or should be. Compared to others, yeah. No, it's nothing. It's child's play. But I often say, you know, you used to just say it was the British who were difficult, and now you have this thing where the Eastern Europeans and the Central Europeans, it's like, oh, there's terrible Central and Eastern European countries, and they're not with us either, and these Scandinavians behave badly, and these Italians, look what they're doing. Like, who are you going to be left with at the end of this negation of everyone? And I think the answer to this is very straightforward. The cordon sanitaire in European politics, to my mind, has been incorrectly placed for a generation. If we are going to place it accurately, it has to be done with unbelievable care. But it has to include majority opinion. Because what has been attempted is for the cordon sanitaire to keep the general public out, which I would submit in my own democratic way is an unsustainable possibility. But I leave it back to you.
Before we turn the mic over to the crowd, I'm sure people want to ask questions. One short additional question to two of the panelists. Dan and Dina, what is your prognosis? What does the future of Europe look like in your view? Dina, perhaps you start this time.
So I guess I get this question a lot, as if I represent all of Europe and its strange death. So I hope it's not going to be a strange death of Europe, Douglas. I really do. I really do. But my prognosis would be maybe different from the prognosis that I would give like 10 years ago, because many things have changed since then, inside of Europe and outside of it. The war in Syria has changed everything. It actually changed the whole course of events. It was a sort of a catalyzer for a lot of processes that would have been more slow, maybe slower, if not the war in Syria and the Arab Spring in general. So maybe in a couple of words, I would summarize the prognosis in, let's say, a hope for a certain kind of maybe integration, even though I really don't like this word and I think that it's, as I said, dead, but maybe a sort of integration, because as you have said earlier, and I agree with you, the identity of Europe is changing. And I don't know if there is a way to go back. I don't think so, actually. I think that the normal way would be to absorb a lot of other influences within Europe, but to keep on going and not to compromise maybe on the more important values. But you understand that we will have to compromise on some of them. We already are. So in a world where definitions are not allowed, there is no us or them or you, but we need to have them. We really need to. And when I say we, I mean Europe, because Israel in some kind is part of Europe, not just because of Eurovision, but really we do share the same values here. So I really do hope that Europe would be able to accommodate many of the cultures and the values that are inserting it, but will be able to also preserve its main important values and not to react maybe too harshly to the changes that are happening, because this reaction would be as radical, if not more radical, than what is happening already inside of Europe in terms of radical Islam.
Dan, before I turn it over to you, maybe one brief remark. My feeling is that Europeans are first overestimating their own tolerance and then reacting violently. So my fear is not just that European culture is committing suicide or going down, is that its reassertion may indeed be dangerous and violent. And one comment on the margin, since we are at the university and I even see some students in the crowd, I think that partly our inability to discuss these things is that under a new postmodern paradigm, which I hope you young students are going to fight against, despite your teachers. The mission of universities has turned from telling the truth to forbidding the telling of truth, to actually mandating lies. And if you look, I teach history of political philosophy, and if you look at gender studies programs, you will see that now they are teaching students not to recount the past as it was, because this only reproduces old power structures, but rather we should search the past for empowering narratives. That is, we should not tell the truth about the past because it perpetuates it. We should start lying about the past in order to correct it, under the assumption that if you correct the mirror, then the face would change itself accordingly. This apparently is not going to happen. So whatever the future holds, I think the first step, and this is such a breath of fresh air to read your book with its honest, direct tone, is its insistence on telling the truth. Dan, 3 minutes, and then we'll open it to the public.
Two short comments, and then I'll try to answer the question about the prognosis. First of all, multiculturalism. I have my own version that I prefer, and I've learned it from a governor of India who issued a decree forbidding sati. Sati is the Indian custom of burning widows alive. And he issued a decree forbidding it. So they told him, you can't forbid it, it's a custom. And he said, you're right, it's a custom, I can't forbid it, I'm not forbidding it. The Indians have a custom of burning widows alive. We British have a custom of hanging people who burn widows alive. So you proceed with your custom and then we'll proceed with ours. I think this is the best approach I can suggest for multiculturalism. Concerning nationalism, I think that we must emphasize that the only antidote to fascism is healthy nationalism. It's not a slippery slope. Once you're national, then you're sliding inevitably towards fascism. It's the other way around. And this has to do now with the question of prognosis. And here is a strange answer to a simple question. It depends on the Americans. In other words, the future of Europe depends on the Americans. If America will be Obamanized, okay, Europe has no future. Because basically you had a European president sitting in the White House, namely nobody sitting in the White House for 8 years. And if America will not provide the leadership, I can't see Europe providing it in spite of an America where a small part of the elite goes in the same direction as Europe. So this is my fear. The major problem in Europe today is polarization. You have the people who are nuts on the one hand, and the response was to become nuts on the other hand. And the question is, can you find something in the middle of the political spectrum? And strangely enough, they can learn something about Israel. What we have in Israel is a completely dysfunctioning political system, like in all democracies, with an unbelievable society, which is the eighth miracle of the world, because about 70% of the Israelis are in the middle of the political spectrum. This, in the final analysis, is the answer. And the Europeans, the best thing they could do is to try and find a middle ground between the Michiganers on the left and the Michiganers on the right, okay? And they should learn Yiddish, because that's the best way to approach.
Oh, let's take some question and see how he goes from there.
Thank you for coming. Okay, my question is it possible, do you think, to create a strong enough identity without involving religion? I mean, if you can take like 3 basic principles, like human in the center, freedom of speech, free markets, okay, 3 basic principles of the European civilization, is it possible to create identity which will not involve religion?
Let's do that. And the lady sitting next to you, let's...
I think that the danger nowadays in Europe and starts in the United States is the cultural jihad, not the jihad of the sword, which we know how to react to. And this goes like a cancer, like a malignant cancer in Europe, and starts in the United States from the time of Obama. What can we do about this?
Enough of this line, row. שם יש בחור שמרים את היד.
Do you believe? Can you hear me?
התכוונו למעליך, אבל בבקשה. שדר את השאלה שלך ונעביר גם לו.
Do you believe that the populist regimes that arose as a backlash against immigration, such as in Poland and Hungary and the populists in Italy, are they in the direction of a solution to the problems that you raise, or are they in the direction of increasing the problem or making it aggravated?
No, there's a guy.
So
yeah.
Thank you very much. I've read your book. It's a great book. Right after hearing you on the podcast, so I'd like to encourage you to do more of these, especially a bit more vertical. It's extremely interesting. Also, I read The Spectator, so thank you for that as well. I'd like to offer a correction, if you'll have it. You said Merkel called Netanyahu to ask for advice. I think in our particular case, she should have called the other guy, because we do not have a large Muslim minority because of Muslim immigration. We have a large Muslim minority because of Jewish immigration.
let's pause and give a chance to respond.
Yes, I think the maybe I can start last. I think the point that Merkel was thinking of the arrival of Russian Jews.
No, so Germans might become a minority in their country, right? She needs advice how to deal with that. That's sort of what happened here. Right? 70 years back. I'm happy
I think yes, I think she was thinking of the Russian and other movement, but the Aliyah. But yeah, exactly. Let me just pick up some of the others briefly. I don't like the term populist, and I don't use it myself. I think it's one of these terms that's undergoing serious slippage, and is cracking under the tension. It's being used for, it's being weaponized, and I think we should be very specific about terms. Now, I think there are several definitions of populism you could refer to. Usually, populism has been to refer to individuals who are sort of one-off, charismatic leaders who, for instance, overstate the division between the public and the elites. That's one. Now, I don't think that's how populist is being used as a term now in Europe. It's being used solely as a term of denigration for something else. Let me give you a very quick example. President Macron is a populist by the definition. He didn't run with a party structure. He was a one-man who broke through the party structures and then had to sort of put together a party after it had happened. Now, that should be, I mean, if it was a non-pejorative spin, Macron should be described as a populist, perhaps the only populist leader in Europe. But he never is. Why? He's not seen to be nationalist. He's not seen to be in favor of closed borders over open borders, and so on and so forth. So I'm very suspicious of this usage. I think that populist in Europe has become the term that people use for people they would like to call racist, but they don't know if that'll work anymore. And people say that this about the East, we have this, I think that the Visegrad group in particular being used to sort of beat the rest of Europe with, in my view, and I think it's very unwise. If the governments in Poland and Hungary are legitimately elected, they're not elected because people have tried this. They've tried the sort of impression that maybe they're not really elected and the ballot's stuffed like Brexit and like Trump. And there's this endless attempt to not accept that the people are voting because they like the people they're voting for, but to pretend that they have been manipulated. And the last stage, the last gasp of this argument is they're really populists. They're sort of manipulating the people. And so I think that all of these countries, their leaders have virtues and vices. I think that Matteo Salvini is probably the single most important political leader in Europe right now. And it goes to this thing of whether it goes right or wrong. I mean, it will depend on individuals. I can see a scenario in which it goes badly wrong in Italy. There was this thing the other week where it didn't get much play internationally, but this migrant who'd been in Italy for some years hijacked the bus he was driving near Milan and got the children. It was filled with 52 children. He doused the bus in kerosene and arranged to start to burn all of the children to death. And he was stopped because of an unbelievably good and successful operation by the Carabinieri. And I just tell you, these things give me shivers. I mean, it goes back to the point you made. I just think when these things happen, you had 52 Italian children burning to death on a bus, on a school bus. I don't know what happens next. I don't know how the Italian public react. They haven't had an attack there yet. I just am filled with horror about these possibilities. And, maybe Matteo Salvini he responded brilliantly to that attack, brilliantly. He gave citizenship to a young Egyptian boy on the bus who had called his father to try to say there's something, you've got to come and tell the police, come and save us. He played it an absolute blinder, as we'd say in England. But, I'm filled with worry about this. And just finally, I suppose it partly refers to the lady's question. But yes, whether you can build a strong identity without religion is a very pregnant question. We've taken some lessons from the Enlightenment that we should have taken, and some perhaps that we shouldn't. Again, I think that the conclusion I come to on this is you almost certainly can't create an identity if you war on your roots, which is very different from urging everyone, for instance, to become a believer, which I don't urge. But it's very hard to see a way through where you hate your roots. And so that's why I urge people to communicate with their roots at the very least. You know, it doesn't work as an exact parallel, but I've often thought Jews who are non-observant, and you may know some, Jews who are non-observant but who don't hate Judaism, they don't hate their religious friends and relatives. They're just the rabbis. But if there were a version of that possible within European culture, within Christian culture, it would strike me as being a healthy attitude. But you don't. It's quite hard to find, because you either get the convert or we all die, or, you know, let's do full atheism on it. And I don't see either working.
Yeah.
It was a sign, definitely. So, just when I decided to add on this one. So, regarding to your question, this is a very important question, because we are all speaking narratives. We all have our own narratives, right? So part of this book and part of what Douglas is actually, I don't know, when I'm saying that you are saying, it means that I'm woman-splaining you? What would it be the term? Right, sorry. So what I actually mean to say is that we have a lot of narratives, and many of the European people who are non-Muslims, okay, they don't have their own narrative at all, because they're not allowed to. And the thing is that if we want to preserve our own identity, we need to have our own narrative and to defend it. And this is the main problem, because whenever you don't teach these narratives in schools, because you're ashamed to teach your own narratives, this is the main problem in raising an identity that would be strong enough without religion. So whenever you raise such a narrative, this would be the time to say, now I have a very strong identity that has my own narrative, my own ethos. I think that Dan has told before, he was speaking about ethos, right? So this is a part of my narrative and my own ethos, British ethos, French ethos, etc. So these narratives are all national narratives. And whenever you just take this component and place it away, you put it aside, you have a real problem in preserving an identity without religion. Thank you.
Before I pass the mic to Dan, just one short comment about populism. I think, Douglas, that it's not always just a euphemism for racism, but also a euphemism for nationalism. And it is an important designation, because we are talking about Europe as one thing, but I think that the unifying force, it's like Marxism turned on its head. The elites of all countries unite. We have a united liberal elite that is attacking democracy by delegitimizing nationalism. So it's delegitimizing the nation state, and by that it's attacking the democratic mechanism, but by which the somewheres, as it were, have their basis of political power. So when discussing the question of populism, if we take out the pejorative content of the term, I think that we can see maybe a resurgence of democratic forces allied against a liberal elite trying to impose liberalism from above without the consent of the governed. Done.
I have no question directed at me, so I will just complete your own sentence. Elites of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your democratic shackles.
Let's have another round of questions. Sharon?
So
You meet a lot
first
of
a comment
Facebook friends
about-
in these events.
So first a comment about what you said about being nationalistic and patriotic and everything. Rabbi Chaim Nabon, who you'll meet on Thursday, once said that today the only group you can root for and belong to is sports group. Anything else is bad. He said this is the only thing, only refuge left. I have a personal question. How many friends did you lose? How many clubs you were kicked out of? Gadi is a good example for that. He's now, and how many do you see coming back? I mean, because there is a change. How many people sort of secretly come to you and say, maybe you were right, or we can talk, or whatever?
I know that the lecture is about Europe and Islam, but I have a couple of questions as an Israeli. First of all, how can we as Israel benefit and exploit this situation that Europe is in? And I think that most of the people here are aware that, or feel that Israel is being judged by other criterias rather than other countries about national acts that we do. And why do you think that is so?
Hi, thank you for coming. Okay, the thing I really want, you were keep saying about narrative and how important it is to be able to connect to your roots, but I think it's not just try and find the good things about European culture, it's also to go on the offensive. I mean, you can't, I mean, from my travels around Europe, it's like people are completely it's like Europeans think they either were the best, let's say 150 years ago, or now they are the worst that ever happened to the world. So there is, I don't know, like to really go and try and have a debate on television. You know, there's things like the Arab slave trade, the 17th, 18th century pirates that took, like, there are things that I think a lot of people are unaware of, and there is only, sorry, it's really hard to, with the microphone. And the second question is, I mean, I think Europe is now really unsafe for people who want to make reform with Islam. Like I and Harsi Ali, I think, fled the Netherlands. Is there someone that you know of that is really trying to open a debate about Islam and trying to reform it, and is it even safe for him, possible, and any voices that you heard lately? Thank you.
Thank you. If I may throw in on the heels of this question, is there a conspiracy of silence now around rising anti-Semitism, as I fear there is in some places?
Thank you. Let me take those in as short order as I can. Firstly, how many friends did I lose? I actually don't think I've lost any for a long time. I lost them all in one go many years ago. And that's fine. I don't need many. The truth is I've gained many more and better friends and cleverer friends. So my own view is that if you're at all interested in pursuing truths, which I think writers and journalists all should be, you can't be overly concerned about your circle or not being invited into certain clubs or anything, none of which bothers me at all. I just marvel at some former colleagues who I wonder how they look at themselves in the mirror. Incidentally, by the way, this happened to me recently. I was in Qatar to do a debate, and I said to somebody, you know, presumably we're going to have to criticize the regime at some point. Oh, yeah, sure. Come the event. Am I on my own? Am I? But that's fine. I thought, well, I can't stand in an audience where the emir's sister and wife are in the audience and not attack them. I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror in the morning. of course I've got to say something about their own policies about migration, their own woeful record. So, yeah, you can't be interested in friends and the truth. Secondly, how Israel could benefit / exploit, I don't know. I mean, you can continue, and I think should continue, to highlight the double standards without expecting that to be, you know, particularly effective. I think you should, as this country is, make friends where you can make friends, and accept that some people will never particularly love you in this generation. I would just, one thing, by the way, which it allows me to make a warning on. There's one thing that worries me a lot at the moment. In Europe, anti-Semitism is now on the left, and it's not really a right-wing force. There's one thing I would note, which is I think there's one way in which it does become a right-wing force again, which is if the perception grabs on, and I've seen it start to migrate from the farthest margin slightly further in. If the thing does catch on, the meme, as it were, which you can just start to hear of, the Jews are in favour of nationalism and nation states for themselves, but want to erode them everywhere else. And I mention this only because you get it on the fringes because of things like the Soros activism and so on. And, you know, I always say, look, he's been trying to undermine certain aspects of Hungarian democracy in the same way he's tried to undermine certain bits of Israeli democracy. So if it's not anti-Semitic to criticise him in Hungary, just as it's not anti-Semitic to criticise him in Israel, but there are certainly people and bits on the fringes of that who are playing with something that they know they're playing with, and they are picking up on this. But I just warn about that because I hear bits of it, and there was one recently with the migrant situation in this country where when some of the people from Africa who'd come here illegally, and then there was a dispute about it, and there was this terrible moment where, as the dispute was going on here in the courts and elsewhere, the news was announced that although Israel wouldn't keep them and make them legal, the EU volunteered to take them, and I just thought, oh, if you want to massively ramp up that and make that fringe point into an absolutely mainstream point on the right, that would be the way. Brilliant. But very quickly, yeah, we're the best, we're the worst. Absolutely, a very common thing it's a common thing of self-hatred, isn't it? Mm-hmm. In individuals as in societies. And the final point on the Islam reform, yeah, I mean, I've been involved in this for a long time. It saddens me that of all the reformers, I've got them in my phone, but by now I'd have hoped there were more. But I know why there aren't, and it's because it's not a very attractive job. Dangerous. It's a dangerous job. It doesn't make you popular. It doesn't make you it makes you very good friends, but it doesn't make you widely loved, and people start to fear it. And I've often wondered why we haven't got more people doing that. And the simple fact is that yeah, why would you apply for a job where it's so unattractive, and why your life may well be at risk on a daily basis where it doesn't need to be. But that having been said, we do have some extraordinary people. You're right, Ayaan ended up having to leave the Netherlands because they took away her passport, basically. They found the one person who really believed in the Netherlands, and they kicked her out. But there are people, my friend and colleague Majid Nawaz in London, you know, he's doing everything he can, and he's got a great number of people around him, and there are others. But, you know, just a final thought on that, which is that my own view on this is that it's a massive strategic, generational mistake to see the problems that the Islamic world is obviously going through, and is going to go through for a very long time to come, and say, why don't we involve ourselves in that struggle, and if the reformers lose, we lose. You see, I'd like to the extent we can in societies like my own to make sure that our own fate is not completely intricately tied with the fate of Islam as a religion. Because if the reformers don't win out, and they may not, at the very least, that's a tragedy for Islam, but I don't want it to be a tragedy for Europe. And yet, a generation of leaders has intertwined these things to such an extent that I don't know how you disentangle them at this stage.
It's based on Muhammad's life. Final comment by Dina and Dan, then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Just a short comment concerning anti-Semitism in Europe. There is something very bad about it and something actually less dangerous than before. The bad thing about it is that now it comes from a much more dangerous angle. Because before you could defend yourself against anti-Semites by bringing in the values of human rights and peace and democracy, and now we have anti-Semitism in the name of human rights and peace. And it's very interesting because it has an anti-Semitic part that I thought would be forgotten in Europe, namely, as before, we are guilty of deicide, of killing God. God used to be something religious, and since they became secular, now God is the new religion of human rights and peace, and we are crucifying human rights and peace. So it's very interesting where it's coming from. Another thing, you take something very medieval, like the idea is that you shouldn't kill the Jews, but you should keep them down because it shows that God made the good decision when he left the Jews and made the Christians his people. And then when you do it, you have to say that God punished them by preventing them, by exiling them from their country. In Europe, unlike any other country, Israel is not considered a country that was established by people who exercised the right of self-determination, but people who were compensated for the Holocaust. And since we gave them this country, Europe has given, Europe has taken away, blessed be the name of Europe. So what you have is this idea, as long as you behave, it's okay, you can have a state. But notice, the only country in the world that has to explain why it needs to exist. Every lumpa umpa can have his country, and it's self-evident because they're umpa lumpas, and their umpa lumpism makes them a nation. But the Jews have to explain. So you can say about France terrible things about what they did in Algeria, but nobody asks, does France has a right to exist? But about the Jews, they do. And this is the very, I think it's a continuation from the Middle East, the medieval idea of you don't deserve it. We have given it to you because we have sinned. And now that you are as sinners as we are, because you're also colonialists, not only we are colonialists, you're colonialists and so on. So that's the bad part. But there is also a good part from, if you look at it from a Jewish point of view. Because most of the anti-Semitism in Europe is focused on Israel today, and we can take it. We're the lightning rod. I mean, we can take the lightning and bring it down directly to earth without anything getting hurt in the middle. Because Israel is so strong, it does not depend on the goodwill of the Europeans. I have a very strange experience in Europe. In every Jewish community that I meet in Europe, with the exception of the community in the Czech Republic, in Prague, everybody, when I meet Jews and the leaders of the Jewish community in this place, come to me, and of their own volition, I'm not asking them a question or anything, they say, you know, Jews don't have a future in Europe. And I say to them, as individuals, you're wrong. In terms of your own personal safety, you're wrong. We're not going to get something like we've had in the 30s and the 1940s. But it's very interesting that they're leaving Europe. And when it comes to my revenge, and I'm a great believer in revenge, I think it's I really, really enjoy revenge. My revenge on Europe is that they're losing their Jews and getting Arabs.
Sorry, I'm gonna be a buzz killer now because, well, that's right. The new anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. Everybody knows that because of the BDS mainly. We were talking about Soros earlier. But what I wanted to say is really brief because well, a wise man said, not me, that what starts with anti-Semitism never ends with anti-Semitism. That means that the morality, the high morality that Europe wants to strive for, is in fact being harmed by the new wave of anti-Semitism within Islam that is changing the anti-Semitism that was already existing inside of Europe. So now when we're not allowed to call anti-Semitism by its name and by its definition within Europe, because it's a bad thing to do, obviously, it's punishable in many ways, then it leaves people very much alone with this problem. And then these levels of anti-Semitism that just rise and rise and rise, and then it really goes on to other realms as well. And which realms we'll only see in the future, because right now we cannot even give an estimate of this problem, which is going to be huge, really, really, really soon.
Well, it probably just is left to me just to say a thank you, really. But let me just, before I do, say one other thing. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning of this book, and what I say in it is received differently everywhere. And I mean, this is, and for legitimate and understandable reasons, it is the only country, I think, which has, and let me put this at its most diplomatic, has somewhere in it a response which is serves you right. And as I say, it's a legitimate response. The only, perhaps, country in the world where it is a totally legitimate response to say, okay, well, you did this yourselves. If I think this repeatedly, I wrote it recently, I was in Vienna, and I was with a colleague, and I was visiting various political figures and others, and you just have this thing, you walk around the streets of Vienna, and I mean, it's not just because I've born and brought up in London, but why are the streets so quiet? Why is it so quiet here? It's no children, yeah, but of course you killed all the Jews. And some people say, well, it's, that's a long time ago, and you think, well, it's not that long ago. It's not so long ago that you can just pretend it away or get over it. So it is completely understandable that from here, at any rate, this is all viewed in a very slightly different light. But I would just finish by saying that, my own view has always been that, basically the view that Prime Minister Aznar expressed many years ago, those of us who admire this country and realize that actually it's things that Europe can learn from Israel, not just things that Israel can learn from Europe. And that to a great extent, all of our fates are in some way intertwined. And as Aznar said, he said then that if Israel goes down, then the whole West goes down. I think there are a lot of us who see that because we look at this country as being some kind of holder on to values that we may have forgotten ourselves. And that you can't like siphon off your soul to another country, but that some things you've managed to do here are at the very least an example to us. I don't think that anyone ends up always being out of history, and my own view is that at some point we in Europe go back into it, and whether we make that a heaven or a hell is in our hands. But I'd like to thank you, because I know on a Tuesday night there's a lot to do in Tel Aviv, but specifically this Tuesday night, and I'm delighted to have been asked to join you. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming and for helping me to avoid Eurovision.
Thank you very much. It was an honor and a privilege to have you, and thank you all for your patience.